seeing with our temperatures increasing and the flow in the river. Before we turn to our amazing group of panelists, I just want to provide a little context for this discussion from a West Slope perspective. It's important to recognize that the Colorado River District, its 15 county area, produces about 65% of the annual average flow in the entire Colorado River. So what's happening here with respect to temperature, snowpack, late season, early season runoff, what's happening here with respect to our snowpack and our flows in our rivers are important to everybody who depends on the Colorado River. Here in our district, we have 500,000 residents. That's our job to protect the water resources and flows for our communities here at the district. But we're not alone in depending on those flows. We're going to hear today from Colby Pellegrino from the Southern Nevada Water Authority, who she's the assistant general manager there. She runs a very important program bringing water to all of the residents of the Las Vegas area. We're going to hear from Lorna Cates from Denver Water, who a large part of their water supply also comes from the Colorado River. And then we'll also hear from Juliet Elleprin from the Washington Post, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who has done a recent series on rising temperatures in hotspots. She really went through some incredibly thick data produced by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency or Administration, to determine that some of the hottest locations in the country and frankly in the world, the biggest areas where we're seeing rising temperatures are right here in the Colorado River District. To kick this discussion off, however, we're going to hear from Jeff Lucas. Jeff is an associate professor at Western Water Assessment associated with the University of Colorado, which works very closely with NOAA in generating science and data for water managers throughout the West. Jeff has been doing his work for over 20 years, working closely with water providers throughout the Colorado River. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. He's going to do a presentation and lay out the groundwork, and then we're going to come back in, let each of the other panelists introduce themselves and their organizations a little bit more. And then we're going to have a conversation among all of us about how and what this means for the quality of life and the future of folks that depend upon the flows of the river. With that, I want to turn it over to Jeff. Jeff, thank you again for coming today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy, and thanks to Jim and Alicia and all the rest of you at the River District, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you on the webinar. It's a great opportunity to talk with you today. So I'm going to share my screen here and hope that that works. Okay. Well, I'm going to give an overview of what the latest science says about the warming climate and recent hydrology in the Colorado River Basin and what we can expect in the future. And those of you who make a habit of attending the River District's annual seminar, as I do, may remember that in 2016, I gave a similar presentation, maybe framed a little differently, but you will hear some familiar themes, but with updated findings and graphics. First, I want to remind us of a harsh reality of the water cycle in our mostly dry region. Of all of the rain and snow that falls on the western slope each year, on average, only about 25% becomes streamflow. And the other 75% goes back up into the atmosphere, having evaporated from soils, water, and snow, and transpired from plants. And the intensity of that red arrow of ET going back up is largely controlled by temperature, as well as by winds, humidity, and solar radiation. And temperatures in the western slope, as everywhere else in the West and nearly all of the globe, have been going up sharply in the last several decades, over 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 40 years. And after 5 really warm years in a row, including the record warm year in calendar 2017, we got a brief reprieve in 2019, last year, which was only just above the 20th century average, the dot at the furthest right on this graph. But then if you look at the summers, and we finished summer or June, July, August 2020, we can see that we're kind of back on the warming track. Summer temperatures in the West Slope have been warming even faster than annual temperatures. And summer 2020 has come in now as the 4th hottest on record. And if we just look at August, it was the hottest on record for the West Slope, the hottest August by over 2 degrees over the 2nd hottest month, which is a huge gap for a monthly temperature record. And this is bad because, as I've already implied, a warmer atmosphere is a thirstier atmosphere. When it's warmer, evapotranspiration as a fraction of precipitation goes up, so that red arrow gets larger given the same amount of precipitation coming down. And snow in the fall and spring becomes rain as temperatures increase past freezing in those seasons. So you tend to end up with reduced snowpacks, and then earlier snowmelt with warmer temperatures and earlier peak runoff. And then you tend to get reduced overall annual flows, reduced groundwater recharge, and reduced soil moisture. So these are all impacts that we associate with drought years, but they can arise from warmer temperatures alone. And when precipitation deficits occur in a warmer climate, then the drought impacts are even worse than they were in the past. So the question is, how much worse are those impacts in a warmer climate? How much exactly does stream flow decrease given a certain amount of warming? As you know, we get big year-to-year swings in precipitation, like between 2018 and 2019. And these swings cause most of our variability from year to year in stream flow. So it's very hard to tease out the effect of warming across all of these diverse stream flow outcomes. But several recent studies listed at the left have used a variety of methods to do just that. And a group of us recently completed a major science assessment report for a consortium of Colorado River Basin water agencies, including the River District, CWCB, Denver Water, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Reclamation. We examined and summarized the studies about the sensitivity of runoff to warming listed at left, as well as 800 other studies and reports. So this report is over 500 pages, so please don't attempt to read it all at once. So in the report, how did we summarize the state of the science regarding streamflow change due to warming in the upper basin? What we see across these studies is that a warming of 1 degree Fahrenheit is associated with a 2 to 6% decrease in annual stream flow. This range mainly reflects the different methodologies of the studies. In the majority of the studies, including the most recent ones, they point to higher values, so 4 to 5% per degree being more likely. And so that's what I list here in the graphic in the slide. This implies that Lee's Ferry stream flows have declined about 8 to 10% over the last 40 years due to warming alone. And of the total stream flow deficit since 2000 at Lee's Ferry, this dry period of now going on 20 years, about half of that stream flow deficit is due to warming alone, with the rest being due to slightly below normal precipitation. So the upshot is we're seeing declining runoff efficiency across the upper basin. We're getting less bang for our precipitation buck. So there's been a lot that has been said and written and tweeted about what happened this spring and summer. We had a normal snowpack in the upper basin on April 1st, but Lake Powell, April to July inflows were only half of normal. So what happened? So first, we had very low soil moisture going into the snow season from the dry summer and fall in 2019. And dry soils are like a tax on the snow melt, since they soak up what would have become runoff that year. But then in April and May, let me say we did have from November through March, fairly normal snowfall and snow accumulation. And so on April 1st, we had a normal looking snowpack. But then the bottom fell out in April and May. We had record dry conditions, record low snow accumulations at most of the snowtell sites in Western Colorado and elsewhere in the upper basin. And so it just sort of cut off that snow accumulation at the knees and really hampered the ability of that normal snowpack to contribute to a normal runoff season. And so this is difficult. We on April 1st, we really don't have the climate forecast tools to tell us that we're going to have an extremely dry, or as in 2015, extremely wet April and May, or May. And if we have extreme conditions in those so maybe sorry, having a little sound issue. So what about the future? Recent basin planning studies have used climate model-based projections to account for future climate change and its likely impacts on hydrology. For those who know and love the acronyms, this is a new data set of 32 CMIP-5 projections that were run through LOCA downscaling and then to produce the streamflows, the VIC hydrologic model. These model runs use the higher end RCP 8.5 emission scenario. The upshot is that basin temperatures in the top graph increase across all model projections by several more degrees on top of the warming we've already experienced in the last 40 years. Annual precipitation in the middle goes up in some projections and down in others, while showing somewhat increased interannual and decadal variability. And across all of the projections, precipitation tilts slightly upwards, so higher precipitations in more runs than not. At the bottom, the pervasive effects of the warming act to tip the ensemble of streamflow projections downward relative to precipitation, so that in most of these individual hydrologic futures, stream flows at least vary decline over the next several decades. But we have much higher confidence in the direction of temperature change, that is more warming, than the direction of precipitation change. So the bottom graph here, which we also showed in the report, maybe is slightly misleading, since it treats what the climate models say about temperature and precipitation as though they were equivalent in terms of our confidence in those results. So here's a version of that same bottom graph in which I've taken out 16 of the 32 projections and left in the 16 projections of future stream flow, where the associated precipitation projection is less, shows less change than in the 16 I've removed. So basically I'm isolating the temperature change and emphasizing that warming effect alone. And you can see by mid-century, nearly all of these streamflow projections point to lower flows in the upper basin, and by a lot. The worst of these suggest, 1/3 of the flow is gone relative to current conditions or recent conditions over the last 40 years of the 21st century. So 10 million acre feet on average across a 40-year period starting around 2060. And all of these projections, it's hard to tell because these are 30-year running averages, but all of these projections have 5 and 10-year periods that are worse than what we've seen in the last 20 years in terms of streamflow deficits. So these are quite dire, both at this long, you kind of more low frequency view where we're just looking at 30-year averages, and in terms of shorter droughts and dry periods that are more meaningful for management of the river. So to summarize, first, precipitation still drives the hydrologic variability that we're seeing, that we see year to year and decade to decade. But the warming is causing overall drying of the water cycle and of hydrology. And studies, including several very recent ones, strongly indicate that warming is already reducing upper basin stream flows by several percent per degree Fahrenheit. In the future, warming, which is almost certain, will drive further reductions in stream flow over the next several decades. Warming also impacts other important aspects of the water cycle and water management, including shifting snowmelt and runoff earlier, increasing crop water use absent a change in crop types or irrigation patterns, and generally increasing what we currently associate with drought impacts, but those drought impacts will start to emerge in what previously had been normal years. And then finally, warming increases wildfire risk, and this year has been a signal example of that, along with 2002, 2012, and 2013 in Colorado. And there are a number of related water impacts as well. So it's unequivocal that warming conditions lead to higher wildfire risk. But it's also true that there are other factors, non-climate factors, that contribute to changing wildfire risk in Colorado and the West. And those are all going up as well, including things like fuel accumulations, more development in the wildland-urban interface, and more frequent human-caused ignitions. So climate change and warming aren't the entire answer to why we have seen more fire in the West and in Colorado in the last 20 years and larger and more intense fires, but it is an important factor, a threat multiplier, if you will, on top of these other non-climate factors that are changing. And then, of course, when we do have large wildfires, particularly in our important watersheds in the upper Colorado Basin and elsewhere in the state and the region, we can experience direct damage to infrastructure. We can experience denudation of slopes and changes to soils that lead to landslides, debris flow, sedimentation, water quality issues, and also changes in the forest canopy in our higher elevation watersheds that have implications for how snow accumulates and melts off. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will turn it back over to Andy.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. I wish I could say that I was somehow inspired by all your grim news, but we did ask you to come and give us the facts, and you've done a great job of communicating that, and appreciate your work and the years that you put into this. I think that list of if I counted correctly, 13 studies that have really looked at this connection between river flow and rising temperatures is really impressive, and something that I know we at the Colorado River District are paying attention to, and I think our fellow speakers here, you'll hear quite a bit of discussion about that. At this point, I think what I'd like to do is introduce and sequence our panelists, and I think first we'll turn to Juliet Elprin from the Washington Post. Juliet is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She actually won the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in explanatory journalism, which perhaps could be why I contacted her, because the stories that she has written about Western Colorado in particular really resonated with me in the way she was capable of explaining what was going on out here in Western Colorado. And while Juliet herself lives in Washington, D.C., she's got this remarkable talent for doing it. And I have to say, I watched her over the last year or plus, actually, as she was investigating these issues in Western Colorado. And the amount of work that Juliet and her team puts into an article that shows up in the Post is really amazing. The number of people she spoke to throughout the West Slope was truly impressive. And I asked her to come talk to us because she's really someone who has been able to reach out and talk to a wide variety of folks and synthesize what these folks have seen on the ground here in Western Colorado. With that, I'm going to ask Juliet to maybe introduce herself and her projects and talk a little bit, give us a few minutes about what it is she found out there on the ground. So thank you, Juliet.
Of course, thanks so much. It's great to be here. I'm sorry that again, we're not, of course, doing it in person. And just a little background for those who aren't familiar with our project, which we called it 2C Beyond the Limit. And essentially what we did, the 2C refers to 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the amount of warming compared to pre-industrial levels that the world has pledged since the early 90s to avoid. And what we decided to do, I want to say, so the stories launched in August of 2019, but we basically decided, I'd say basically February of 2019, we started talking about what would it mean for us to map every spot in the world that had already reached what globally would be a tremendous tipping point. And so we have an incredibly talented data reporter, John Meiskens, who hasn't yet turned 30 at the Post, who crunched the numbers, working with another colleague of mine, Chris Mooney, and we all kind of pitched in with our expertise, and we were able to map it. And what was interesting is, again, we didn't know exactly what we would find, and we're frankly, somewhat surprised to realize that 10% of the globe has already warmed 2 degrees, using, again, kind of federal data dating back to 1895. And then what we were able to do, we could identify areas, just, looking at this threshold. But when you looked at, for example, the United States, and you looked at the level that the county level data that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found, we realized that basically it ended up being about 12% of the counties that had warmed in the United States were in Western Colorado. And then there were there are a couple more in Eastern Utah. And so I will take any excuse to go to Colorado. And so I called dibs. We have to have arm wrestling matches on these things. And so, but it did take me a while. I didn't go till October of last year, but basically we wanted to figure out kind of what this means on the ground for people. And one of the interesting things, as you might imagine, particularly we did a little over a dozen stories, is that you're always trying to figure out, how you can write about it in different ways. Are you writing about what's happening with sea level rise? Are you writing about the disappearance of ice? And so, of course, when it came to writing about the Western Slope, I really wanted to write about water, not only because, of course, it matters so much to so many sectors and people who live there, but frankly, as someone who is an East Coaster, I'm a DC resident, born and bred, and have worked for the Post for most of my career. I feel like folks on the East Coast don't often understand water issues, water scarcity, water rights. And so it seemed to me that this was a way to explain it. And so, discussed, like I mainly decided that in order to that, I wanted to talk to different folks, including, of course, water regulators but also farmers, and that would be a way to explain it. And of course, I spent time with a few different folks. I ended up devoting much of my time to spending time and talking with Norman and Paul Kmeyer, who are fantastic and live in Eckert, and raise hay crops. Although I also spent time, and our photographer followed up with David and John Harold, who raise a whole range of crops and also have livestock. And so that's really what we were trying to explore. And just one footnote is that it was not until literally a week before publication, I went back to our data reporter and I said, can we say that this is the largest climate hotspot in the lower 48? Because we hadn't crunched the numbers that way, and we had a whole debate about how to do it. And we found it out, and what amused me is that once the story published, it went viral, it really caught on. And one of the top editors said, it's so great that you decided to go to the largest climate hotspot in the United States. I said, yeah, I didn't know that till about 2 days before publication, but you're right, that's how I planned it all along.
Thank you so much. I think, I know I've enjoyed reading your reporting, and I think your graphics team did a great job with some of the graphics showing those changes in temperatures, and really appreciate that. I'm going to turn now to bring on Colby Pellegrino, who is the Assistant General Manager at the Southern Nevada Water Authority. As I introduce Colby, I think there's some, I just want to hit a couple technical things. We have a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. We would love for you, for anybody who has questions for our panel, to put your questions in there. I will do my best to get those in and weave those in as we have our panel discussion coming up here. Really appreciate it. To the extent that you cannot, we don't answer your questions, we are going to provide in the chat email addresses for our panel's speakers, so you can reach out directly to myself or the panel and ask them questions directly. We do want to try to answer your questions, but I also happen to know that we've got well over 200 people on the Zoom presentation today, and we may not be able to reach all of those questions. I will say, in introducing Colby, she's been in the river working for Southern Nevada Water Authority since 2003. And I've had a few people on the West Slope already asking me, well, why are you bringing a lower basin utility assistant general manager? Why do we want to hear from them? And I think this is a really important issue for why the Colorado River District is successful at protecting West Slope water. We have to develop, and we have developed, really important relationships with water users throughout the basin. We have to recognize that while the snowpack falls here and the water falls here, even our own state law doesn't say it can only be used on the West Slope. It says our state law says it's available under the Constitution for appropriation anywhere for a beneficial use. Our compacts that govern the lower basin, where Colby's from, and the upper basin, say that, you know, Southern Nevada, or excuse me, Nevada gets a certain share of the river. We won't go into the details of that, but we've got to work with our partners on the river. And frankly, I think today we're recognizing, after 21 years of really extreme drought, that our futures are tied together more than we ever probably realized back in 1922 when the compact was first negotiated. We have got to work together in order to make sure that we have a vibrant future ahead of us for all of us. Colby does a great job at Southern Nevada Water Authority. She is currently, one of her tasks she's been assigned is the small task of leading the negotiation team on the interstate negotiations on the Colorado River. It's a really small and easy thing, very little complexity involved in Colby's job. But she came into Southern Nevada as to work in their climate modeling department and helping figure out what was likely to come and how they might adapt to it. And so, Colby, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us a little bit more about why you would want to talk to people in Western Colorado. So thank you.
Hi, thanks, Sandy. I really appreciate you having me here today. As you mentioned, I've been here since late 2002. I started as an intern, and my first task was Colorado River modeling. Today I oversee all of our resource planning, our water conservation programs, our public information strategies related to those. And for those of you who might not be familiar with who we are, what we service, Southern Nevada Water Authority is essentially the wholesale water provider for the greater Las Vegas Valley. So the Strip and all 2.2 million people that surround it. Another key fact in understanding our concerns about the river and the greater river is despite Nevada only being allocated 1.8% of the total flow of the river, our community is over 90% reliant on the Colorado River for our water supply. So it's a very small percentage of what's appropriated, but about the totality of what serves our valley here. So just like the river as a whole, Las Vegas is going to be impacted by climate change. We are still growing, we're still urbanizing, and we've made great success in being able to do so on limited resources because of our water conservation programs. In 2002, we actually used more than our allocation of the Colorado River just to meet the demand that we had then. Since that time, we have reduced our water use by 52% per capita and our overall consumptive use of water by about 33%. So we are diverting less water today by almost 100,000 acre feet per year than we did in 2002. And when we look at the bigger picture of what's happening on the Colorado River, I think that's just an example of what everyone's going to have to get even better at doing long term. We have this long-term average flow of the river that we all hear about being 14.7 million acre feet. We all know that there's 16.5 million acre feet allocated. The current drought has only given us 12.7 million acre feet, and climate change projections suggest that that's not an anomaly between now and the end of the century, that we may be seeing something in the range of 12 to 13.5 million acre feet. Locally, if we just look at our local area, you guys have been one of the fastest warming. Our warming has not been as significant, but still has a huge impact on our water demand. So we often use a reference called gallons per capita per day. That's where we take our total use divided by the number of people that are here, and it allows us to benchmark essentially what we're doing on conservation. So in 2018, we used 113 gallons per capita per day. In 2019, that was all the way down to 101, which was a huge drop, which was largely related to that really wet weather that hit the upper basin, also hit Southern Nevada. And while Southern Nevada doesn't really produce any water resource for us, it does change our customer demands. So we got a big benefit, but it's not a lasting one from that rain. And as we look out and plan for how much conservation we need to do and what kind of programs we need to bring on, we know that just between now and 2035, if nothing else changes in how we use water, the impact of increased temperatures in our local service area will increase everyone's use by 9 gallons per capita per day. So when we look at how much water we need to conserve and the programs that we build to remain a sustainable user of Colorado River water, we have to take into account how much we need to reduce our use and what conservation gains we need just to meet the growing population, as well as the upward pressure on demand that we're going to see from climate change and the diminishment of our supply. So all of those things are interrelated, but in a nutshell, I think that's why I'm here to talk about some of the things that we've done and how they might relate to similar decisions happening across the basin.
Well, thank you very much, Colby. That is a lot of work that you're engaged in, and some pretty serious obligations you have to provide water to a wide variety of the population down there. And at this point, I'm going to turn to and introduce our final panelist, and that's Lorna Cates. Lorna directs Denver Water's Climate Science Policy and Adaptation Program. Her primary responsibility is to lead climate investigations and implement findings to inform planning, policy, and research. There's part of her bio that really interests me, and I'm hoping at the end of our session we'll be able to get into it. She is, and I want to read directly from what I was provided, the lead practitioner of the decision-making under deep uncertainty society. So that sounds like something that if I were part of would involve a lot of, I don't know, perhaps hard alcohol in order to understand exactly what's going on there, Lorna. I wonder, I do want to point out once again, people often say when we bring speakers in from Denver Water, why are you talking to Denver Water? They're taking our water from our mountains. And it's true. Denver Water is a long-standing major trans-basin diverter out of the headwaters of the Colorado River. But I can tell you from our own experience at the River District that working and collaborating, and frankly, even though we have significant disagreements, if we can continue the conversation with Denver Water about how we all do better and do more with less water, it's going to benefit the people in Western Colorado and the people in Denver. With that, Lorna, I'll turn it over to you, and if you could let our viewers know what you're up to and what your role is at Denver and exactly why Denver's willing to come talk to us. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Andy. I'm glad to be part of the conversation, and this is a great panel. I'm really excited about the discussion. So I'm going to introduce our approach to Denver to climate adaptation by presenting our 5 messages on climate adaptation. So I thought this would be a good way to continue the conversation that we've heard from Jeff and Juliet, and also start to inform the conversation that we'll have in the discussion. So my first point, which we heard from Juliet and Jeff, is that climate change is here and now. It is not the next generation's challenge. And for a long time, we thought it was the next generation's challenge, but we were mistaken. It's here and now, and it's a big deal. That leads me to my second point. At its most fundamental, climate change is water change. And in a semi-arid region like Colorado, where we deal with drought all the time, we need to continuously monitor, continuously work to understand, and continuously adapt to these changing conditions. My third point is that climate change does not only impact the natural side and the hydrologic side of our businesses. It impacts all organizational functions, from human resources to finance. So this is really, really interesting. This year has been a good example of this, an unfortunate example of this. We're seeing how climate change is jeopardizing the health and safety of our outdoor workforce. So our outdoor workforce are out there breathing in the horrible air quality from the wildfires that we've had in Colorado and really across the entire western part of our continent. They're also dealing with increasing heat extremes and heat waves. Regarding finance, municipal bonds in general are considered to be safe and good investments, and the financial sector wants to keep them that way. So water utilities are now graded on not only if we are preparing for climate change, but how we are preparing for climate change, because they want to make sure they're on it, and they want to make sure that their investments are safe investments. My fourth point is that Denver Water is actively working to preparing for climate change. So I'm going to give 3 examples of this that I think exemplify our activities. The first is our legacy of long-range planning. So we've done long-range planning for decades, and in 2008 we adopted scenario planning so that we could better understand a range of plausible ways the future could come to fruition and make sure that we are prepared for whatever the future may be. So it's not predict and plan, rather it is plan, 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 plan. In our approach to scenario planning, we are assuming that the future is going to be warmer or it's going to be hotter. So we're trying to understand what warming means and what significant or warming or really hotter conditions means to continuously meeting customers' needs over time. Our goal is to build adaptive capacity in our system so that we have the flexibility in our operations and in our investments to continuously provide this public health resource. The second example of climate adaptation in action is our From Forests to Faucets program. This is a multi-million-dollar partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, the Colorado Forest Service, and other partners. And its focus is to treat and restore watersheds. And by 2021, we will have treated nearly 90,000 acres of watersheds. And the value of this project has already shown to be tremendously, have a high, benefit cost ratio. The wildfire that took place in over Buffalo Mountain in 2018, we estimate that it saved nearly $1 billion in damage to infrastructure, residential housing from the watershed management restoration that we did throughout that watershed. The next example is one that we did this summer, and it was really, really fun. It's actually kind of, so we were going to do this tabletop in person, but we had to transition to be virtual, and we had this conversation with 35 folks throughout Denver Water. So we focused on what does climate change mean to water treatment, water distribution, to our finance department, and to watershed forest health. Watershed and forest health. So we brought all 4 of those groups together for this conversation so that we could talk about the risks and opportunities that climate change presents. And as a side note, one thing that we learned in that conversation is that Denver Water is vulnerable to sea level rise and hurricanes because our chemicals and some of our materials come in through the ports of Houston and LA. Our chemicals are coming from the coastal region, so we're vulnerable. My last point, and this gets to exactly what Andy was talking about, we are better together, and we should not try to prepare for climate change alone. We're all connected by water. We're all vulnerable to climate change. Together, we can build climate resilience. Together, we can create innovative solutions that will work for Colorado. And together, we can create a future where we thrive. So thanks, Andy.
Well, thank you so much, Lorna. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask if we can have all the panelists turn on their cameras, and we're going to, as I warned the panelists earlier, we're going to have a little conversation. I'm going to spur it with some questions, both from me and the audience, but I'm just hoping to have a good conversation with all of you. I really appreciate your expertise and your thoughts on all these issues. You've all hit on this a little bit already in your presentations, but I want to talk about, from your perspective in your area of the woods, or in Juliet in Western Colorado where you were looking, I want to talk about what's already visible from these rising temperatures. What's already happening to your customers or your utilities? Jeff, I'm going to start with you just because you touched on this, and it's the soil moisture issue that you talked about. And frankly, in the water policy world, we're looking at that issue and knew last year at this time that we were entering the winter season with incredibly dry soil. Unfortunately, it feels like we're about to do the same thing again. Can you tell me why we should care about that? And is that related to these high temperatures? And how do you know that? Who's studying that? What kind of data is out there?
Yeah, so that, as I suggested in the 2020 example, and having cited it earlier from what you said, Andy, it is a key linkage in our water cycle that we often don't think of it because we look at our snowpack, gauge its size, and then say, okay, snowpack becomes runoff, and forget that, the vast majority of our runoff doesn't flow overland as surface runoff directly from the snowpack. It is mediated through soil moisture and shallow groundwater, and often there's a lag of time, even a couple of years, as 1 year snowmelt basically infiltrates through soil moisture into shallow groundwater and pushes previously stored groundwater out towards the stream channel. And the soils are this interface where from above is just potential runoff, and it can evaporate back out, or it can infiltrate further and become runoff. And so it is this really important hinge. And what you see, what we're seeing is that both observations and projections point to drier soils with a warming climate. Now, when you have a really dry, dry soils coming into the snow season like we did in 2019 and like we did in 2020, that's of course not solely because of warmer temperatures. It's also because we happen to have some dry months, unfortunately timed right before we were accumulating snow. So that will happen. The warming just makes that atmosphere thirsty and pulls it back out. We are getting better through NOAA Colorado Basin River Forecast Center at forecasting or anticipating the effects of those drier soils on the next year's runoff. So something I meant to mention as I was talking about 2020 is that even though we had a near normal snowpack on April 1st, the CBRFC was forecasting only 78% of normal April to July inflows to Lake Powell. And a big part of that gap was their anticipation that those very dry antecedent soil moisture conditions would pull out, a lot of that potential runoff, maybe 10 to 15% relative to normal. And the rest of the gap is associated with the warming effect, which they are increasingly incorporating into their forecasts. So it in very dry conditions like we've had the last year, and it sure looks like we've got very dry soils coming into this year, you can expect attacks of 10% or more depending on the watershed and the extent of that soil moisture deficit.
Jeff, that's really helpful to understand. I want to turn to Juliet. Juliet, you were out talking with the Heralds and others this spring. What are they seeing in their farming operations? These are multi-generational families on the West Slope that have been farming. Are they do they see what Jeff's describing? And if so, what are they doing about it?
Absolutely. There's just no question, there's basically, there's not a person, that I met on the slope who didn't recognize that things were hotter and drier, and talked about both, the temperature change and exactly what Jeff's saying. I mean, again, farmers are incredibly attuned to the variability in the weather, which sometimes, it becomes a little more of a challenge of seeing long-term patterns, but certain things are visible, and particularly because they know so much about the soils, they see what's happening with drier soils and how that connects to runoff and water availability. So there was a broad appreciation for kind of that phenomenon. And then, so how do they respond to it? There are a range of, responses, and I think they include certainly, of course, putting in new irrigation infrastructure. That's certainly something that seemed to be a pretty a pretty universal response. Obviously, to some extent, particularly when that's subsidized by the federal government, that makes it easier to do. So although that said, I also found deep skepticism, kind of obviously what any decent farmer would say was, they didn't see irrigation as the answer, because they always said, if we get better irrigation systems, we're going to use more water to take advantage of that and grow as much as we can. So they actually, as much as they were using it to adapt to the conditions, they didn't see it as really a solution in some ways. So I think that some of the other things that folks looked at, obviously in certain cases, is the idea of leasing water, if you, in a given year, if they felt like they could get more bang for the buck. And that certainly happened with the K-Meyers after the 2018 drought. But also broadly, and I talked to a number of, for example, ag professors about what's going on, we certainly are seeing a shift to higher value crops. That seems to be, another phenomenon we're seeing, whether it's stone fruit, whether it's, brandy from apples, because you're going to make more money that way, things like that. So, like flash freezing of vegetables is another thing people talk about. So I think, it's kind of all the question of how much value can you get out of the water that you have, and that's kind of what many folks are looking at.
That's great, Juliet. I think I've certainly seen and heard many of our producers talking about exactly what you're mentioning. I want to now turn to Lorna, because I think the same issues are facing Denver, and we often get involved in discussions, comparative discussions about the value of the urban landscape versus the agricultural landscape. And I don't think we need to have that dispute or debate right now. I think there's no doubt that whether it's an urban landscape in Glenwood Springs, where I live in the downtown area, or one in Denver, it's really important for the quality of life of those residents. Lorna, what are you seeing in Denver in terms of water consumption as we're seeing these hotter and drier summers? Is your water consumption spiking, or are you able to combat that with conservation measures? And if so, how are you doing that?
Yeah, that's great, Andy. So, this summer has been really hot and dry. August was pretty brutal in particular, but our customers are doing great with respect to efficiency. So you guys might remember, we've talked about this a bunch, but we actively started working, maybe more aggressively started working on conservation following the 2002 drought. And we made goals to decrease per capita water use by 22%, which we have met those goals. Not only have we met those goals, so we've been able to sustain those goals. And we're transforming our water conservation program into a water efficiency program where we're talking individually with customers. So customers get a grade on your water bill. So you're compared against the other folks in your neighborhood, on your street, other water users that are similar to you, so you know how you're doing. But generally our customers are doing really, really well. So I pulled this out because I'm a customer of Denver Water. But here's our rules for the summer. And lots of water utilities, I'll go through these in a second, but lots of water utilities use these as a drought, once they hit a drought level, they start implementing these rules. And for us, these rules are in place all the time. So things like you only water between after 6 p.m. and before 10 a.m., right? Because you don't want to water during the heat of the day. It gets to everything that Jeff's talking about, where evaporative losses are really, really high. Winds has picked up during the day. You just don't want to be watering them. We water 3 days a week. And then we have recommendations on how much you need to water based on the type of vegetation you have and the type of technology you're using to water. So it's really very cool. So the other thing that we're working on is a water efficiency plan. And we're halfway through developing that plan. And again, it's getting back to our one-on-one kind of communication with our customers. So we're really trying to meet people where they're at, recognize what they're doing, and then talk to people about how they can improve. So this is a little bit of a different approach than doing more of a broader, just overall campaign to say reduce your water use. We're saying this is what you're doing, and this is where we can get better, and this is where we can go. The other thing that we're tracking is the technology that's out there. There's so much technology out there, and it is just continuously evolving. So we want to make sure we understand that we know what's available for our customers to use, what we would recommend for our customers to use, and that we are also adopting it at Denver Water.
That's great, Lorna. Thank you very much for that insight. And Colby, I want to hit on the same thing with you, and I'll just give you the perspective that I get from a lot of Coloradans as they go down to your service area in Vegas, or I should say as they used to in a normal world, go down to Vegas, and everybody that I shouldn't say everybody, a vast majority of folks who've been to Vegas from Colorado say, man, what a wasteful place. That water, the water they have in their faucets, or their, you look at all the showers in the hotels and the hot tubs and the fountains at the Bellagio, and what do they think they're in, somewhere in the Midwest or on the East Coast? Those people waste water, right? So that's what I hear. Just so you know, I actually usually inform them that I'm pretty sure you have the lowest per capita water use of any major city in the U.S. You spoke a little bit about this, and I think the number that you spoke after 2002 was a 52% drop in your per capita gallons per day for your population. How did you guys achieve that? And are there additional steps that you're looking at taking with your water use to bring that down?
Yeah, that's great. So I do think that I'll take on the strip first. And it's hard when you're walking down the strip to not see the Bellagio fountains and make gross assumptions about the entire service area. The reality is, number one, the Bellagio fountains don't get Colorado River water. They use nuisance groundwater, shallow groundwater that cannot be used for potable purposes. But two, when we have that angle of walking down the strip, you really don't get a view for how much property the strip covers and the very small area that those fountains represent. So 7 out of every 10 Nevadans live in our service area. And I believe it's about 7 out of every 10 in our service area in some way are directly related to employment on the strip. So in terms of bang for their buck, that's pretty good economic use of water with all of the tourism under a non-COVID situation that it generates. But that being said, the biggest uses, Southern Nevada is unique in that we are so close to the Colorado River and we're in a closed basin that naturally drains to the Colorado River. We're also a fairly new community in terms of regional type infrastructure where almost all of our customers are directly connected to the sanitary sewer. All of that water is treated to a high level and returned to Lake Mead. And our allocation of water to come off of the river is a consumptive use allocation, not a diversion allocation. So because we're getting everything that goes in a toilet, in a shower, in a sink back to the river, we focus almost exclusively on that outdoor water use in terms of our water conservation planning, because that's what's being lost from a resource perspective from our community and from the river as a water consumption. So we have a three-legged approach that we've implemented to address water conservation in our service area: regulation, incentives, and education. If you want to go 4, we'll say pricing, because some people consider that separate or not. We do have tiered water rates for all of our customers based upon meter size. The more water you use, the more you pay for it. But by far the most effective thing at actually decreasing use is regulation. So starting in 2004, we placed limitations on all new development. You cannot have turf in your front yard if you built your house past 2004. Other than schools and parks, there is absolutely no residential turf allowed to be developed in the valley. So anything you see driving through the valley is stuff that existed prior to 2004, if it's outside of a school or a park. We limited the amount of turf in the backyard to 50% of the backyard area. So those were the most effective at curbing wasteful water use going forward. And then we made incentive programs for existing customers. So we pay right now $3 a square foot for somebody to remove turf and convert that to water efficient landscaping. To date, we have removed 196 million square feet of turf through those incentive programs in the Las Vegas Valley. We are the largest program of its kind in that regard, but it takes significant investment. We spent $244 million making that investment. We also have other incentive programs, none that perform quite to the level that Water Smart Landscaping does in terms of water savings, but we do have sort of a one-size-fits-all where any business can come to us and present a plan for how they could reduce their water use. And they're provided dollar per acre foot incentive that's the same as that turf conversion. So if somebody wants to take an evaporative cooler out and put in an air-cooled system, that's something that we'll provide an incentive for. We do see that for things like low flush toilets, and we do incentivize them. We've also seen people come and take that nuisance water that I told you exists in our valley and put in RO systems so that they can use that water instead of just pumping it off of their property. So there's a lot of things like that we've done, and really education is the third part. you know, a farmer is very attuned to how much water their crops need and when they need it, and making sure they don't overwater. That is not the same for somebody's backyard and their turf. We see almost the same amount of potential savings in just getting people to change their watering clocks seasonally as we do in removing turf. That's really hard water to go after, because you have to get somebody to do something 3 times a year at a minimum every single year in order to gain that water savings. Whereas getting somebody to take out the turf is easy. Getting them to change their clock over and over is hard. So we invest in advertising in order to do that, direct mail. We are also incentivizing smart controllers that look at adjusting water use automatically seasonally. And we're actually starting a research project now to develop a smart controller where we have some control over the seasonal watering restrictions and adjusting water use on the clock to be able to ensure compliance for those that are interested in doing that. I could talk for days about conservation, but another area that we're really just starting to hit the ground running on is evaporative cooling. By far, landscaping uses are the largest consumptive use of water in the valley, but evaporative cooling is probably number 2. And I would guess that we're easily in the 30,000 acre foot a year range for how much water is used for evaporative cooling in this valley. And so we're looking at alternative cooling technology, what the trade-offs are for that, and how we can begin to create the same sort of regulation, incentive, and education around cooling that we have around landscape water uses, is sort of the next horizon for where we'll go here locally.
That's all really interesting, Colby. I've always been fascinated on your cash for grass program. In Colorado, we have a different cash for grass concept, but we definitely appreciate what you guys are doing down there, and I think it really does show, as someone who I should say used to fly into the greater Las Vegas area for meetings quite a bit. I can see a change in the last 10 or 15 years, and there's definitely impressive gains that you're making. I want to, we could talk about land use and water all day long, because I think it matters to all of our communities. But I want to go back to some of the bigger issues facing all of us with these rising temperatures. And I think you've talked about the conservation. Lorna's talked about it. Juliet talked about some modifications to on-farm issues. But I wonder, really, there's also, I think both Colby, you and Lorna's, you guys your organizations are both pursuing major new infrastructure projects. And I think, Colby, maybe in terms of planning, the one that is fascinating to me, if you could talk a little bit about the low lake level pumping station, and why is it that Southern Nevada has put in hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this new pumping station that's down at below Lake Mead. So what are you anticipating that would cause you to spend that kind of money?
That's a great question. So we have put $1.4 billion into our low lake level pumping station and the associated intake, number 3. The infrastructure that's used to divert that Colorado River water, which is 90% of our supply, into the valley, is in the form of 2 existing intakes that draw water from Lake Mead. One sits at elevation 1050. The other sits at elevation 1000. So at the turn of the century, when this drought hit and we started examining what the future of Lake Mead elevations could look like, we quite frankly didn't want to be dependent upon everybody else conserving enough water that we could physically draw water from Lake Mead. In addition to that, as Lake Mead goes down, our water quality changes significantly. Lake Mead is a stratified lake where there's that cooler, cleaner water at the bottom generally, and warmer, high organic water at the top of the reservoir. So even if our intakes stay underwater, as the reservoir goes down, our treatment costs would increase significantly. So we invested in the infrastructure to build an intake out into the historical foul wagon Lake Mead. We did some really expensive water quality modeling to show that that would be an area as the lake declined that would constantly maintain good quality water to divert. And then once the intake was completed, we almost immediately started on the pump station associated with that. For those of you that are not familiar with these very large pumps that we have, they're difficult to reset in elevation. You know, they're only optimized for a certain head range. So having an intake station that's specifically targeted to bringing water into the valley below the depths of our existing intakes is what we moved forward with. The Lake Mead, the way Hoover Dam is constructed, it cannot release water to downstream users at elevation 895. That's significantly lower than where we're at today, but our intake is at a depth of 875 feet, and we can pump water from below the outlet of Hoover Dam. So we've essentially given ourselves an insurance policy that from an engineering standpoint, we'll be able to continue to withdraw whatever our share of water is under those decreased shortage conditions at any Lake Mead elevation. And I think if there was any one activity that really contributed to the security of our water supply, it's probably the intake over any conservation we've done, physically being able to deliver that water to the valley.
Yeah, well, Colby, that's really interesting that your planners and yourself leading the charge really are so clearly convinced that this is a possibility or even a probability that you would spend those kind of resources preparing yourself for that water shortage. I think it speaks volumes that all of us should hear loud and clear, that people who study these issues day in and day out are that concerned about the flows of the river that you'd spend that kind of resources to do that. And it's not even a tourist attraction, so I'm really surprised that Vegas would fund something like that. But maybe there's a way you could turn it into a tourist attraction, right? I mean, I want to touch on this with Lorna. Lorna, Denver Water has been in the press recently about the Gross Reservoir expansion. Obviously, our district had a lot to say about that early on before we reached the historic Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. But maybe you can explain, is that being driven by these rising temperatures and lower flows? And if so, what's the connection there, Laura?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So our Gross Reservoir expansion project is a project to expand the Gross Reservoir, which is in the northern part of our system on the east slope of the Continental Divide by 131 feet. It's pretty exciting. It's trying to get at this interesting vulnerability that we identified in one of our earlier planning processes, where we realized that 10% of our storage was in the northern part of our system, but the majority of our storage, 90% of it, is in the southern part of our system, and that is a huge vulnerability. So when it comes to things like wildfires, you know, we are even potentially anticipating seeing burn-on-burn types of events or back-to-back burning events. When those things take place, we need to have as much flexibility as possible to continue to meet water needs. So we are expanding Gross Reservoir to expand the storage capacity in the northern part of our system. So it's really pretty straightforward. It's kind of I think it's a smart solution to dealing with this vulnerability, but it's not the only solution that we're looking at. You know, we really embark on this all of the above type approach where water use efficiency, looking at reuse water. So we're spending a lot of time looking at reuse to make sure we have the right water for the right purpose. These are these one water principles, as well as ensuring that we have supply and storage available to meet future needs. It's all part of the conversation. It's all eggs that we want to have in our basket. One thing that we want to make sure to avoid, just like anyone else would want to avoid in developing like your retirement plan or whatnot. You don't want to be fully invested in one resource. You want to have a diversified set of assets because you're not exactly sure what's going to happen in the future. And when it comes to providing this public health resource, we need to make sure we can continuously provide water.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. Juliet, I wanted to turn to you and in your work. I want to talk more about kind of the perspective of the farmers and ranchers that you talk to. Are they feeling, was there a sense of resignation or a sense of optimism that our farming and ranching community on the West Slope would be able to innovate our way out of this challenge? What did you pick up in terms of the basic feeling of these folks? Are they throwing in their shovels and walking away, or are they doubling down on their operations, Juliet?
I think they're not throwing in the towel. I think that many of them who have already, taken on the improbable task of doing farming in this day and age are committed to doing it. And again, I think, as you mentioned, there are people who've been doing it for multiple generations. And I think when you do that, that kind of provides that extra incentive to figure out a way to adapt. So I think overall, none of them think that it's easy. And, they're trying to figure out what to do. For example, the Heralds have this No Chico Brush coalition, a group where they're talking to folks. They're certainly worried about the water being taken away from these other users. And so that's a real threat, and they're aware of it. But I think that there's no one I met who said, this is hopeless, it's not, forget it. So that certainly was the general takeaway that I had.
Okay, well, Juliet, I really appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. I think we're at our end of our time. I could talk to you guys all day long, and I think actually so could the people who are listening in. I just want to thank you very much for your participation, your insight. I want to say, as a closing, we know we have a huge challenge facing us with these rising temperatures, but I know I have faith in humanity and you folks that we can work together and actually create solutions that keep all of our communities vibrant, keep the Colorado River in balance. We've got to do a better job of doing that together. It's going to be a real challenge. I see Jeff shaking his head, just worried that I think maybe I'm the optimistic fool from Jeff's perspective, but I think we can. So I want to thank you again for being here, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the audience hanging in with us and listening to these tough subjects. So thank you very much. And we'll see you tomorrow at our final and last day, which is a secondary economic impact study that the River District with a whole bunch of partners put together, looking at the future of agriculture on the West Slope if we're going to have a demand management program. So it's really looking at what that might do. Thank you again, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.